so far. Things were worse in the cities than in the small towns, for here people would share their stamps around. You pooled your stamps together to buy a special item. There was nothing you could do. You couldn't fight them. There were stamps for car tires and for gas. Servicemen might get some while home on a pass. But those working at home had to do a carpool. Don't ask for more. The ration board you couldn't fool. There were stamps for food, especially for meat. You saved up your coupons so you could have a treat. Coffee was rationed, so you used the grounds twice. The taste wasn't good, but it felt awfully nice. Stamps were used for sugar and flour too. Stamps for oleo instead of butter would do. You used substitutes, it didn't matter what kind. You used any types that the stores could find. You stood in line with coupons in your hand. There were so many things that you'd like to demand, but there were others there too, with families big, and when you got your share, you felt like a pig. Somehow we all survived the ration stamp war, though life was never quite the same as it was before. I remember going to the store with my ration stamps to get some butter and some other items too. And there were 3 lines, and so I saw this one line was awfully long, and I said, "What are you waiting for?" "Oh, we're waiting for oleo." Oleo. I had never used it. We were Jewish. We didn't use lard because it was from a pig, and the oleo I had seen looked like lard. But I thought, if there are that many people waiting for it, it must be really good. So I changed lanes, got out of the butter lane and got into the oleo lane, and I took home this block of white stuff that looked just like lard. But there was a little capsule in it, and my mother looked at me and she wondered why I had even brought it home. But there was a little capsule of coloring, and so you put that coloring on it, and then you mixed it and you mixed it and you mixed it, and it finally turned yellow. And so then we would eat it, and there was a difference in taste, I'll agree, but not that much. But they said that Wisconsin was fighting against coloring it because it was the dairy state and they didn't want the competition. But that was my first experience with oleo. But I worked at that time I was working at Wilson Company, which was the branch of the famous Wilson Company in Chicago. We didn't have meat products there. We had dairy products, and most of our products were going to the armed services. We had the first program of making powdered eggs, and the machinery was 2 stories high, and it processed the eggs. We had women who cracked the eggs and put them in these bins, and they went into the storage and made the powdered eggs, and those were all sent to the servicemen too. We had to try them, of course, to see if they were edible. And in small quantities to make scrambled eggs, they were delicious. But the boys in the service got them where they were made in big tubs and halfway cold before they got to eat them, so they would complain bitterly. So when we were at the Fort Leavenworth at any of the programs, and they said, "Where did you work? What did you do?" I worked in the office at Wilson Company, but I didn't tell them that we made powdered eggs because that was a no-no. It was.
You didn't want to be associated.
I didn't want to be associated with anything that they disliked. So, but.
Then the next one was for the women and who will be listening to all this. It has to do with silk hose.
Silk hose. Once silk hose were available, I remember it well, and just to buy a pair was all that office girls could tell. We left our offices to heck with the work. It'd be there waiting, we wouldn't shirk. But the lines to the clothing store were over a block long, and those who finally got one pair just had to be strong. The Japanese silkworms surely didn't know to what lengths for beauty our women would go. For the silk that they spun, which is a long story, made hose for our women in all their glory. And with the war in effect, no luxuries we had. The Japanese knew we wanted them, and we wanted them bad. So instead of silk, there were heavier rayon hose, and how we put up with those, no one knows. They weren't the nice thin nylons that we wear now, but were heavier cotton rayon blends that we wore somehow. They had a seam up the back, which never seemed straight, but you felt you had to wear them when you went on a date. Without hose, you'd cover your legs with a lotion so tan, but if you got out in the rain, then the color ran. Silk hose were used as a bartering agent too, and the greatest of gifts that could be given to you. Black market reigned, and our servicemen tried to get a few pair, and if so, they would hide the hose and use them overseas, a favor to trade. If they found the right gal, then they had it made. Now we buy nylons without giving a thought, how we prized those silk hose then, and usually got naught. Yeah, we would have the rumor go out that silk hose were available at this one clothing store in particular, and every office was vacated immediately. The girls were running down to try to get in line to buy that one pair of silk hose because they were a real luxury. And we love it. This is the Blue Star flag that we displayed in our homes. I happen to have two granddaughters and a grandson in service. I can't find a third star, but I thought this might be interesting to show. But these were the Blue Star flags that we had and that are in my poem.
Would you like to read that poem that goes with that?
I don't want to take too much time, but
That's fine, yes.
Okay.
Yeah. I don't have the page number for that, but I'm sure you know where it is.
well, I had a. Let's see. Okay. Do you remember the Blue Star flags? Do you remember World War II? Do you remember our servicemen true? Do you remember that some would fall and in serving our country give their all? For it was wartime and everyone helped to win the war. Thank heavens our military kept it over there so far. Then one by one boys were drafted or enlisted on their own. The parents were all weeping as their boys were all gone. Remember Blue Star flags in windows we'd show, so the whole world about our sons would know that they were protecting what we deemed liberty and were fighting overseas for you and for me. And if the blue star that was there showing would change to a gold star and be glowing, it meant that our loved ones had met the test and in some foreign land would be laid to rest. No more would we wait for V-mail letters to come. No more would we hope that he'd soon be home. The message that they brought starting, we regret, brought a message of death we'll never forget. In some cities they built a monument high to show the names of each gal and each guy who fought for our country and met their fate, with the name of each one and their death date. And we look at the names of those so young, and we think of the tributes that should be sung. Alas, those young people will never grow old, and are remembered now only on the monument cold. This is my Blue Star flag. The V-mail I mentioned, if no one else has told you about it, was the best way that
It's okay.
It's okay.
that the boys would write to us from overseas. It was not quite as large as wide as this, and it was censored by some officer before they could mail it to us. So many times you would get their letter, and the V, of course, was for victory, V-mail. It was censored so badly where they would cut out or black out anything that they thought was telling us anything that was happening overseas. We didn't have TV at that time. We didn't have as many roving correspondents to give us the news every night on the radio. And so the V-mail was our only connection with the boys. And of course, there were no cell phones at that time, and we couldn't even talk to them as we do now. So the V-mail letters were waited for and treasured, and I don't have any anymore, but I kept mine for a long time. So,
How do you think the war affected you the most?
World War II?
World War II, yes.
I think the main thing was that I met my husband, and my father had been in the Navy in World War I, and I wanted to be in World War II and couldn't, and I met him and had all these cousins in the war. We rationed everything. We saved all our newspapers. We didn't have as many as we do now, of course, but the newspapers were collected. All of our metal was collected. All of our gold, if you had any gold rings or coins, they asked you to turn those in. I was working for a doctor, and he enlisted in the Army, and so that's when I started working for Wilson Company as a secretary there. We were given the E award, E for efficiency or effort, and each one of us got a certificate and an E that we wore proudly that we were helping the war effort. It changed everyone's lives. I lost a cousin at Iwo Jima. My aunt and uncle never got over it. He had a younger brother that wanted to enlist, and he wasn't allowed to because one person had been killed in the family. At that time, they did not accept two of the same family in the same war zone. In fact, when my two sons were overseas in Vietnam, one was in Vietnam and the other one wanted to be there so he could see his brother. So he volunteered to go to Nam and was refused at that time. Then he was sent over later. By the time the second was sent over, the first one had to come home because of the 7 Sullivan boys who had been all killed in one time. So it was disruptive to everybody. We were lucky that our towns weren't bombed here as they were overseas. I had a very close cousin in the Air Force, a B-14 bomber who was shot down over Germany and was in a prisoner of war camp for 22 months until the war ended. And I was lucky that I got a letter from him possibly once every 2 months, and we could write to him. Everything had to go through the Red Cross to get to the POW camps. We could send 1 box of food each month, so our family all collaborated, and we would take turns because he could only receive 1 box, and that was through the Red Cross too. Their rations were so small that if they had some watery soup or half a piece of potato a day, that was about all they got. But the Germans were hungry themselves, so you couldn't fault them for that. And they were feeding all these prisoners. Other than that, I don't remember too much other than what you probably have already heard with Ken here.
Well, let's end on a higher note. You said at the beginning that you thought Charlevoix has changed in positive ways. What are the changes you see that are most beneficial for the town?
I think the fact that we have industry here now, because prior to that it was all summer. When I first came here, Clarence took me around showing me the town, and I saw these huge 15-room houses that were called cottages and were used only in the summer months. People would come up here with their whole entourage of servants, have a separate little house for their servants to live in while they were here all summer. I had never seen anything like this. To me, it was quite an experience. because where I live, we had industry and full all year round jobs. So that was quite a shock to see those, and knowing that in the cities, 2 and 3 families were having to crowd into one apartment because they had no space, you know. But the houses up here were small, that were available, were small and kind of box-like, and we didn't want to move to Petoskey, so my husband started building our own. And he had had no experience, but he learned quickly, and he did a fabulous job, and the house is still there.
That's wonderful.
I'd like to have it again, but I can't afford 2 homes right now. You had asked me about the auxiliaries, and I know that Kenneth told you a lot about the VFW, I'm sure, and the Marines. Our auxiliary, the VFW auxiliary, was organized in 1945, before I came here, and we only have 1 member living now who was a charter member, and that's Pauline Russell. But our first president was Eva King, whose husband owned a grocery store down on Antrim Street, and where Ken Staley has now. And my husband joined the VFW immediately, and I joined about 1950, I think it was, or 51, something like that. And I've been very active in it ever since. I've held every office and president 4 or 5 times, 6 times. And then finally, I joined the we were having a little conflict between the VFW and the American Legion, because the American Legion felt that they were not of the same thing that the VFW were talking about, their war experiences. The American Legion members had not been overseas. The VFW members sometimes looked down their nose at the Legion members because they stayed home, quote unquote. They stayed in the United States instead of going overseas. So finally, the members of both groups joined each other if they could to make the conflict stop. And so I joined the American Legion Auxiliary along with it. We do a great deal of work with the veterans. We help them in any way we can. We put on dinners, we put on raffles. We have helped when the VFW building was first started, or before they started, we met up over the building downtown where was the A&P store on Bridge Street, and they used to have feather parties for Thanksgiving and Christmas. There was no bingo as such allowed, so they called it a feather party. It was that, according to Michigan state laws, but they did give chickens and hams and turkeys for prizes instead of money. Then when they built the new building, which burned down several years ago, our auxiliary put on dinners every Monday night for 3 years for the Kiwanis group in order to make money to buy the tables and chairs for that building. And we, both groups sold poppies in March, which are made by hospitalized veterans. And the money, the hospitalized veterans gain a few cents for each poppy that they make. The money that we receive for the poppies all goes into a relief fund, and that relief fund is used just for that, for helping veterans out. We send money to the various veterans hospitals in Grand Rapids, up north, and all over. We send to the Chapel of 4 Chaplains, whose story is well known, of going down with the ship, pardon me. It's not a boat, it's a ship. We send to the Veterans Home in Eaton Rapids, the National Home for Children, to help support that. And we just help any veterans who are in need financially or physically in town also. And at first we were having a little difficulty because the women belonging to both groups had trouble knowing which one they would sell for. So finally we devised a plan of taking turns, which was legal. And we would take 1 week for the VFW, 1 week for the American Legion. The next year we would reverse the process. Then we marched in all the parades that they had, and our uniforms were white dresses with blue neck scarves. No one wore slacks in those days. And I'm proud to say that I marched in every parade except one that I had a broken leg, and I rode in that parade. And last year I finally condescended, or this year, rather, this first of the year, I finally condescended to ride in the parade instead of marching. And I missed it. I missed the marching.
So you can march next year.
I hope I can march next year.